Hello, and welcome to everyone who has joined us today for this webinar hosted by the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence. Established in 2005 in response to reports of systematic gender-based violence in Darfur, Sudan, 11 NGOs, along with Irish Aid, the Irish Defence Forces, and the Irish Red Cross came together to work in partnership with grassroots and women's rights organizations to bring an end to gender-based violence. I'm Mary Van Lieshout, the co-chair of the consortium and deputy CEO of Goal Global. I'm joined by Roisin Gallagher, our coordinator, by Niamh O'Connor McCabe, the ICGBV Program Support Officer, and Elizabeth Dettori, author of our paper, Tracking the Money Towards Ending Gender-Based Violence. This policy paper was published by the ICGBV in March of this year. The paper provides a high-level snapshot on the state of funding and financing opportunities in relation to gender-based violence prevention, mitigation, and response. We're delighted that as author of the paper, Elizabeth is here to present the key findings and recommendations. The paper was launched earlier this year at the 68th United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in New York at a side event co-hosted by the ICGBV, the Irish government, and others, with recommendations made to the OECD, the World Bank, and other donors on the need to increase funds to end gender-based violence and improve the funding architecture. Furthermore, the research findings and side event helped to inform Ireland's national position, pushing for increased, sustainable, and flexible financing to end gender-based violence. Funding to end gender-based violence remains unacceptably low, at only 0.69% of total humanitarian funding and less than 1% of all overseas development assistance. This webinar will equip us with the information we need as we seek to address this. Elizabeth Dettori is an international public policy and gender development professional and former senior advisor at the UNICEF Executive Office. Today, Elizabeth will present over the next 30 minutes or so an overview of global funding for humanitarian and development programming to end gender-based violence. Roisin will then facilitate a question and answer discussion, so please type questions in the chat as they arise. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the time allowed. This session will be recorded and shared on the ICGBV website. I'll now hand over to Elizabeth Dettori, who will bring us through the key findings on the current state of funding to end gender-based violence, the leading platforms for tracking funding flows, the emerging opportunities, and the key recommendations from the research. Thanks again for joining us. I hope you find it a fulfilling and enriching seminar, and I'll now welcome Elizabeth Dettori to the podium.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate that introduction, and welcome to everyone who's joining. I know that we've got a lot of participants from different regions and different types of organizations that are here with us today, and hopefully we'll be able to hear from a diversity of vantage points from within the field as we move into the conversation in the second half. So, as Mary mentioned, members of the consortium are going to be monitoring the chat. Please do put in your questions or clarifications, items that you'd like more information on. We're going to share, I believe, a copy of the presentation at the end or as a follow-up, and you'll see that there's a lot of references to external partners and external resources, and those will be linked and provided for you, so you'll be able to access them directly. And I want to just quickly go through what we're going to be covering today. So as Mary said, this is a high-level paper that was presented at CSW in March of this year. And really, it was meant to be a paper that could be used by a whole range of actors within the international development and gender-based violence field. So if you're a donor who maybe is interested in GBV but doesn't necessarily know a ton about it, there's some information about what GBV is, what the scope of prevention, mitigation, and response are, how it happens across the life cycle. If you're someone who works in the GBV field and you want to know a little bit more information about what donors are giving money to GBV and where, we're going to go ahead and look at the state of evidence on GBV financing. And in particular, we're going to look at two of the very, very critical tracking mechanisms, the OECD creditor rating system and OCHA's financial tracking system. We're going to highlight some of the new and emerging opportunities for funding. Of course, it is primarily government's responsibility to be funding, but the scope of GBV is so large and impacts everyone everywhere. We really need to use any opportunity we can to harness more resources. So we're going to talk about what that might look like outside of traditional government funding or major foundation funding. We're going to look at what are the recommendations to donors. For many of us in the field, they're going to be things that you've been saying and hearing for a long time. Give more, give better. We're going to look at some of the key existing partnerships and resources that are available, and then also just quickly touch base on some of the upcoming opportunities to participate in different events or funding around GBV. So even though I assume most people on this call are going to have some familiarity with GBV, I am going to give a quick snapshot on some of the history of the sector and also how we defined GBV for the purpose of this paper and how that informed what we looked at. So this is, of course, a very timely period to be looking at GBV because we're about 30 years on from the seminal Fourth World Conference on Women that was held in Beijing. And in the past several years, there have been a number of formal and informal efforts to pull GBV out from the umbrellas under which it had previously existed and to really identify it as a standalone area of programming, a standalone area that required data, required research, requires human resources, requires financial resources. Some of you might be familiar with this phenomenon in the hard sciences of multiple discoveries that occur separately from one another. And this idea that when there are a certain number of factors in place, different groups independently will begin working on the same issues. And we can see that that really happened within the development field around GBV. So in 2014, the WHO released a seminal study looking at the prevalence on violence against women. And in that study, they estimated that 1 in 3 women will experience gender-based violence over the course of her life. At the same time, in 2014, the World Bank released a costing estimate looking at what is the actual cost to GBV to countries. Shortly thereafter, in 2015, we had for the first time GBV pulled out as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, we know that the process to develop the goals was a multi-year process, so we can see how the earlier research of WHO and the World Bank were also related to the SDGs. And in the SDGs, in Goal 5, which is around gender equality, we see that underneath the 9 targets, 2 of them are explicitly about gender-based violence. So we have target 5.2, which is ending all violence and exploitation of women and girls. And we have target 5. Oh, sorry, I think we've got one person whose microphone is on. Oh.
You're now on mute, Elizabeth.
Am I back on?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as I was mentioning, we have the 2 targets under the SDG. Shortly thereafter, in 2016, we really, for the purpose of our conversation, start to get to the point where we can start to track money. So we have the OECD introduces a purpose code 15180, which is about ending violence against women and girls. And in the humanitarian sector, we have the introduction of GBV as an area of responsibility underneath the IASC framework, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. And then right around that same time, or shortly thereafter, we have in 2019 the launch of a seminal report that was done by Voice and IRC, which is about where is the money, right? And so really looking to say, okay, now we have these platforms to track funding. Let's find out what's really going on with the funding. And, you can see on the screen, I've included some snapshots and we'll include the links to some recent research reports that are looking at prevalence. We have UNICEF just released a report earlier this month, I think maybe a week and a half ago, on violence against children, sexual violence. And we also have, of course, these emerging threats around online violence and online exploitation, and quite a number of partnerships and data and research are springing up around that. So I assume many people here are familiar with these concepts, but we want to just quickly highlight that we are really thinking about GBV across the full scale of prevention, mitigation, and response. And as practitioners, as policymakers, as funders, as researchers, you'll see that this issue of what is GBV across this continuum and across the sociological framework comes up a lot in the sense of it's very hard for us to track and disaggregate across these different domains. So we can see that because GBV is so multi-sectoral and is occurring across all of the domains of the socio-ecological framework, is occurring across the lifespan, is occurring in specific forum or dynamics. So we have intimate partner violence, we have violence in schools, we have online violence. It's really a massive, massive area of work. And as the tracking of the sector becomes more sophisticated, hopefully we'll have the resources to be able to begin to track in more granularity. But you'll see that right now we don't necessarily have that. For the purpose of this conversation, we're really talking about GBV in all of its totality. You'll see there are occasionally some references to data that are looking at violence against women, or you'll see some references to resources for violence against children. But of course, we know there's huge overlap. We know that gender-based violence is not synonymous with women and girls. We know it also occurs for men and boys. We know that our friends and family and colleagues in the LGBTQI community have many particular vulnerabilities. We don't go into extreme detail on those different groups within this paper, but they are highlighted, and hopefully if you have a chance to look at the paper, you can find some of the resources we use to look at those different communities. So here we go. So I think, of course, we all know that GBV actually costs a lot. It costs a lot in finances for countries. We have this World Bank estimate that showed that GBV costs 3.7% of gross domestic product. And we know that it costs in human terms for individuals, for families, that it is imprinted epigenetically, that it impacts all different manners of outcomes. And as I mentioned, that there's really been a push for practitioners to understand what is happening with funding. And so here's just a quick snapshot on some of the most recent research that's looking at funding. I want to point out two pieces of research in particular. So you can see the Investing Wisely screenshot here is from the Prevention Collaborative. That is an ongoing and recent research project that is particularly interested in looking at the state of funding for violence against women prevention in low-income countries, and is very interested in the dynamics of giving. And so really exploring why is it so hard to get money to frontline workers who are in the communities who are really at the forefront of the work. If you are an organization that matches that, they have, I believe it's still open, a survey you can take to have your thoughts known on what your experience is and what sorts of best practices you hope donors will take on. And related to that is right next to it, you see the What Counts report. That was released in the fall of 2023, and that was done by a group called the Accelerator on Violence Prevention. They are a consortium type partnership that is really focused on what they've called the shared advocacy agenda about funding on violence prevention. And they work with SBRI and some of the key donors, and they collaborate with the Prevention Collaborative. And so their goal is to take perspectives from all across the field and all regions and to collectively advocate together for best practices and more funding. And they have a second report that's going to be released in 2026 that's looking specifically at establishing baselines at national government levels. So there's this kind of percolation of interest in what is the status of funding. So as I mentioned, there's really two main tracking modalities. One is the OECD creditor rating system. There are two codes that are primarily used to look at violence against women. So the first code is 15180. That's an explicit code that is for violence. And you can see, even though it has grown year over year, the amount of funding is frightfully low. And we have over here some of the main donors who are giving to GBV. Just a note for people who aren't familiar with the OECD, it is a separate organization from the UN. It's a separate system. There are some limitations to it because not all countries participate in it. And while it is mandatory for members of the OECD who are part of what's called the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, to report, not all members have to report. It's primarily voluntary outside of that. And some key governments don't report. So none of the BRIC countries currently report into the OECD creditor rating system. But so this gives you a quick snapshot. We see that funding is very low. Now, the next code that people use to consider is just loading here, is the OECD Purpose Code 15170. And that's a purpose code that's looking at women's rights organizations, movements, and government institutions. Now, this code is very interesting because there's a lot of opportunity here, but some challenges. We, of course, as practitioners, know that women's rights organizations and movements very often are proxies for gender-based violence-related work, but they're not mutually synonymous. So there is a chance that there are women's rights organizations in other sectors that aren't being captured, or that there are women's rights organizations that aren't exactly working on gender-based violence that are captured. And perhaps more problematically for our purpose here is that this code also includes and government institutions. And the purpose of this code, when you go into the OECD's guidance, is they're looking specifically at strengthening organizations. So again, that's why we have some issues around what this code is actually capturing as it relates to GBV. Surely it's capturing some of the work, it might not be capturing all of it. And for government institutions, we don't necessarily know. Often they'll say that it's going to a gender ministry, but we don't know what the remit of that gender ministry is. We don't know how that gender ministry is funded. So there's some ambiguity around this code. There has been a push, though, within the OECD to add some additional clarity and what they call sub-channels of codings around women's rights organizations and movements. And that's very recent. I believe that the most recent paper on it was presented in July of 2024, so just a few months ago, and was presented by some of the working group, the internal staff working on gender, to the government members of the DAC, and now governments have a chance to review. And I don't know their process as well as some of the UN processes, but I presume it'll be a few months of technical reviews and fine tuning. And so it might be that in the next year or maybe the next couple of years, we're going to have some more resources around getting at a granular level for how to use this creditor rating system. So now earlier this morning, pre-recorded a little demo that I'm going to show, which is going to actually walk us through how to use the creditor reporting system and some of the other resources on the OECD's website. So if you're not someone who's used the system before, or you haven't used it in a while, it's going to give you a refresher on how to actually go through the system, pull up the type of data you're looking for, and how to get the information you need to do the work that you are doing. So I'm going to go ahead and play this.
Through using the OECD creditor reporting system. The OECD is in the process of migrating all of their data to a new website, and because the volume of data is so massive, it is taking quite a while for them to finalize the update. So while you can certainly access all of this if you go to the main OECD webpage, which if you haven't spent time looking at, I highly recommend that you do, I'm going to go ahead and just go straight to the creditor reporting system. So I'm going to open that up, and it can take a while for things to load, so don't be surprised if that happens. You can see that the OECD has already begun to split up the data into different areas for ease of use. I'm going to go to aid activities, and I'm going to go ahead and open the data. Now, I've already opened the data on my page because of the fact that it can take a while. So this is what comes up when you select that data option. It's the actual creditor reporting system. I'm going to go ahead and open up these filters, and you can see that it's preloaded for me all aid sectors that the donors are the DAC countries, the official DAC members of the OECD, that it's using official development assistance, ODA, that it's looking at disbursements, that it's in the last 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't need all of the sectors because I'm not looking at education and health and environment and water. I'm looking specifically for the codes that we are interested in around gender-based violence. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all sectors, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to type in women, and it's going to pull up the 2 codes that we've been looking at, and I'm going to go ahead and choose ending violence against women and girls. And so what this is now doing is it's giving me the option to filter the data just by this purpose code. So I can now go ahead and ask for a table. It's going to automatically populate how much money on this purpose code went to the following countries. I can look at a chart. I can download the data in an Excel format. I can come over here and look at donors and say, I don't want just the DAC countries. I also want to add other members of, maybe I want to look at all the private donors, so I can go ahead and add their information in. So you have all different types of ways of sorting through the information. You can see, you can choose which country it went to. You could add in other purpose codes if you wanted. I could add in the Women's Rights Organization code. Now you can see here that the data is getting very, very large, so it can take a while to process, and it can also take a while to sort through. Now, I want to go ahead and just show you a couple of other things that the OECD does. Now, if we went back to the first page, instead of going to aid activities, if we went to targeted gender equality and we went ahead and opened up that data, what it would show us is data that has been identified through the OECD's gender marker. So this isn't going to be specific to gender-based violence, but it is the broader gender equality and women's empowerment. And they have a very detailed note on how they've identified their different components of their gender marker. So you can go ahead and see that here it's giving you different types of scoring for how relevant something is for gender equality and women's empowerment. And they've already preloaded a number of data sets for you on that. Now, many of you might be familiar with this old page, which is the previous version of the OECD, But if you aren't inclined to spend time on the creditor reporting system, if you don't want to wade through all the data on your own, the OECD does publish these updates they typically publish them in March, right before CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, and they have pre-loaded charts for you that are very easy to use. You can see that they're primarily focused on gender equality, but they do include breakouts also on the purpose codes that are of the most interest to us. So I highly recommend spending some time looking at both the OECD's older website and also looking at the new website, and using the creditor reporting system to really dive deep to get to the granular level of detail that is of the most use for you, depending on where you work or which donors you primarily interact with.
Okay, so I'm going to come back online here. So that's a very quick overview of the CRS. It is a tremendous resource across all sectors, and you can definitely find a ton of information, and it can take a while to load. I do want to just reiterate that, and it is such a large set of data that it's taking a while for them to finalize the migration of all of the data. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, while we think of OECD data as really covering a lot of the development system, the main tracking system in the humanitarian space is OCHA's financial tracking system. So again, I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview since we have a mixed group here. But OCHA, as many of you might know, is the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And it's the primary UN agency that helps to coordinate humanitarian response. And OCHA is the chair of a system, a group that's called the IASC, and that stands for Interagency Standing Committee. It's so many acronyms. That's one of the best parts of having left the UN is I don't normally speak in so many acronyms anymore, so please bear with me. But the IASC is a standing group of UN agencies and other humanitarian actors that coordinate with one another on humanitarian response. And I'm simplifying a little bit, just excuse me, for the sake of time. But under the IASC, we have something called the cluster system. And that's a system where different agencies have an assigned leadership role in organizing all of the different actors working on that cluster or outcome area. So there are 11 clusters. And underneath the clusters, there can be what are called areas of responsibility, and those are more targeted areas of programming. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2016, GBV became an area of responsibility in the cluster system. And what that means is that there is now a specific agency that leads on organizing GBV response. So GBV falls underneath the protection cluster. That cluster is led by UNHCR, but UNHCR is not the lead of the GBV area of responsibility. That is UNFPA, the UN Population Fund. So part of the reason we need to know this is when we start to go through the financial tracking system, we're going to see how the money is being channeled through different UN agencies, and that corresponds to how things are organized within the cluster system. But similar to the OECD creditor rating system, the tracking system for OCHA has challenges around multi-sectoral coding and capturing the full breadth of response. Some of this is maybe related to what's happening on the ground. So let's say I'm a water engineer and I'm coming in to build a latrine in a camp, and I don't necessarily think to code the planning for how I'm building the latrine as part of a GBV response. And let's say maybe we don't have enough GBV practitioners on the ground, either because of human resources or financial resources, and they don't catch that, hey, actually, my colleague who's a water engineer and is coding under WASH is actually doing things that are fundamental to GBV prevention. So we have some challenges around this. But you can see here that we only have a few years worth of data. This is again because of how recently the area of responsibility was established. And I want to just compare the two charts here for you quickly. So you can see on the top, this is the data that was available when we published this paper. And you can see on the bottom data that I pulled this morning. So the volume of reporting that's happening is huge. It's being updated constantly, but you're definitely going to see fluctuations over time, even for the previous year or even the 2 previous years as information comes in and goes through a validation process. And I should flag for both OECD and for OCHA, the issue of validation is part of the reason that colleagues like to present this data in 2-year bundles, because it helps to smooth out some of the statistical irregularities or when there are multi-year disbursements. So you'll probably see in this presentation and certainly in the range of material that's available publicly that different groups present the data slightly differently. But I think overall, the main message is still the same. There's just not enough money going to gender-based violence. So whether we say it's 0.06% or 1%, or you can slice and dice it, but the main issue is that it is radically, radically underfunded. And all of the tracking shows that no matter how you look at the data. So I'm going to go ahead and similarly, I recorded a short little demo just to show you how it works. And I'm going to play that. And then we're going to talk about some of the issues about capturing data and then look at some of the partnerships.
Using OCHA's financial tracking service. Similar to OECD, I am going to go straight to the tracker. I'm not going to go through the main website, though certainly there's a lot of very helpful information on OCHA's primary website around gender-based violence and related interventions. But I'm going to go ahead and just look specifically at funding for gender-based violence. So I'm going to go up to global sectors. I'm going to go to all global sectors, and I'm going to go to protection, and I'm going to find the area of responsibility for gender-based violence. And you're going to see that it's going to automatically pull up a ton of information for us about funding for this year. So it's already showing me that for this year, only 21% of the funding that's needed for humanitarian appeals has been met. We're going to scroll down. It's giving me a trend line. So you can see that this is information that we just showed, and you can see how much the data changes as the year progresses. We're going to scroll down. We're going to see funding for all of the different humanitarian appeals. These are humanitarian response plans, which are coordinated appeals that are submitted through OCHA. We have flash appeals, which are emergency and emergency needs, so armed conflict or natural disasters. We have regional response plans. These are often multi-year, multi-country humanitarian planning. We're going to scroll down. We're going to see that it immediately shows us who our large donors are. It's going to show us who's receiving funding. So here we can see that UNFPA has received the bulk of funds. But again, because UNFPA is the lead of the area of responsibility, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to actually use all those funds themselves, but they're the primary steward of them and of coordinating their use in the responses. We can see where the money has gone by country. So it's automatically pulling up a ton of data for us. It's very easy to download. It's very easy to use as graphics. Now, let's say that I want to look at where money has gone just by country. I can come over here. I can select Afghanistan. It's going to give me information about funding over the years. It's going to give me information about who the primary funders are, funding by sector, so I can go ahead and see how has the various areas of GBV been funded. You can see it's very, very small for Afghanistan. It shows me where the money is going, what NGOs. So there's just a tremendous amount of information. You can also search by donor. So I really personally find the FTS very easy to use and very intuitive. I think that because it is real-time information, it's changing constantly, it's being updated in real time, and it's really geared towards practitioners. So I really encourage people to look at it. You can just find out so much information on the website. And I also want to say that I think that the FTS does a really good job of acknowledging some of the different challenges that they have. And so if you scroll down and go to the About page, they really give you a really easy to digest explanation of what the FTS is, how it started, how they go ahead and validate information. They have a team, but a very small team. I think it might be as few as 2 full-time staff in Istanbul that are doing real-time validation and review of reports that are coming in from all over the world, or from emergencies all over the world. And they give information about how to submit. You don't have to be a UN agency to submit, but they do have guidelines and minimum standards. So I really recommend looking at the FTS if you haven't. It's very, very helpful, and it is an absolutely critical tracking tool for understanding how gender-based violence in emergencies is being funded and supported. And I think
Similarly, it's just giving you a walkthrough of how to use the FTS if you're not familiar with it, and it provides a little bit of a demonstration. So we've only got a few minutes left before we open up to conversation, and I want to just quickly highlight some of the other areas of funding that we explored in the paper. And again, as I mentioned, of course, it's primarily governments who need to be responsible for funding, but because of how important this work is, it's really incumbent upon us to explore all of the different funding opportunities ahead of us. The World Bank and the development bank system in general is hugely important for this, not just in the amount of money that they're giving, but also in the way that they're shaping data around funding. They have a number of different funding modalities and financing products that can be used to impact gender-based violence. I do want to just point out here, though, that linked to the issue around coding, we can see even in the World Bank that there are these issues of how different systems don't match up. So here you can see that the World Bank, they say that they spent $680 million on GBV operations between 2017 and 2022. But if you go to the World Bank's OECD creditor reporting system, it shows a much lower number. I believe the last time I double checked it, it showed 251.9 million under the OECD creditor reporting system. So you can see that there's some sort of discrepancy between their internal tracking and what's getting reported to OECD. And at the time of this paper, at least, there was not a lot of great publicly available information about how the different international organizations coordinate amongst themselves. So of course, the World Bank system is separate from the UN. It's part of the Bretton Woods system. We have the UN system. We have the OECD, which is its own system. We haven't even begun to talk about regional organizations, but you can see that is this issue of everyone has their own process and their own coding, and they don't necessarily match up. I'm going to skip Generation Equality and Spotlight Initiative. Those are 2 UN-related initiatives. And I want to just quickly touch on the W+ standard. So this is something that a lot of people may not be familiar with, and it's related to the open markets. And in particular, the W+ standard was developed as a financial product that can be bought and sold in markets, and it is similar to carbon credits. It's looking at investing in programs that are related to gender equality. It was developed by a group called WOCAN, which is focused on agriculture, and it's a group of civil society organizations, nonprofits that are women-led in multiple regions. And the criteria for the W+ standard was developed in partnership with women on the ground. It's a really new, very innovative type of product. Of course, we know that markets are not a panacea. We know that there are real issues with greenwashing and pinkwashing in the private sector. So we certainly don't want to at all tout this as some sort of savior for funding and that it's going to replace government funding, but more to highlight that there are these emerging opportunities to start to bring in groups that don't traditionally work on gender-based violence. And just to say the W+ standard, it has multiple subsections of the typology of programs that are available to invest in. GBV is not a standalone section under the W+ at this time, but there are multiple sections that are directly related to it. So lastly, I think, well, almost lastly, I think, we can see that there's a real need for donors to give much more targeted funding to GBV. There's a need for donors to be giving to frontline organizations. Right now, we have so much money that goes to Global North organizations or that is passed through the UN system or through multinational settings. And very often money doesn't get down to the front line. And we know this is a huge problem. We know also that many donors are aware of this, but they haven't necessarily moved from awareness to action. So that's something that we really want to focus on in all of our different capacities, is how do we continue to advocate for more funding, for flexible funding, multi-year, not earmarked, not including onerous reporting or submission proposals, making sure it's getting to people on the ground who are actually doing the work. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of partnerships that are working in this area. This is just a highlight of a few of them. We have the Prevention Collaborative. We have Together for Girls, which is looking at data. We have Safe Online. We have Childlight Institute, which is a new data institute focusing on children. So there's a lot of resources here. We're going to include links to all of that so that you can take your time to look through them and to find resources or data that might be of use to you. And many of these organizations, we've got some UN initiatives, but I'm going to just breeze past those. I think people are pretty familiar with a lot of those. But many of these organizations are either participating in the SBRI forum that's happening this week. And if you haven't already looked online, you should look at the program and you should see if there's any webinars you want to join or see if there's any research or partners you want to connect with. There's the Net Hope Global Summit that's coming up, which also has an online component. This is not exclusive to GBV, but it does include a lot of private sector actors and potentially non-traditional donors. And this summit has been around for about 20 years, I believe, and is really looking at how technology can contribute to global goods. So we also have the First Ministerial Conference on Violence Against Children coming up. We have the We Protect Global Summit. And then I wanted to just highlight for people that there is still an open grant call as part of the second round of What Works. And a lot of the groups that are doing open calls, such as the Safe Online Fund or Spotlight Initiative or SBRI, their calls closed over the summer or in the early fall. So these are groups, though, that you might want to keep an eye on as you start thinking about your planning for the upcoming year. If you are someone who is either looking for funding, or if you are a funder, also thinking about how you can do co-funding or complementary funding, where you can streamline your request and your reporting so that it's less onerous for colleagues who are on the ground, on the front lines, doing the work. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to go ahead and hand over to Roy Sheen. We have about a half hour, I think, or a little bit under. I went longer, so we don't have that much time, but we're going to have a little bit of time for conversation, and we'll certainly be sending follow-ups as needed. So thank you to everyone for your time.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that comprehensive presentation on the paper and on tracking the money, and gave us lots of tips and tools on how to access the different databases, as well as the opportunities and challenges within. Now we want to open the floor to questions. We don't have any questions that emerged just yet in the chat, so maybe people were waiting and they want to come online and speak. So we're just going to opening the floor now to have your questions. So please, if you can raise your hand, if you wish to come on mic and ask a question, alternatively write a question in the chat. Thanks. Colin, there we go. We'll go to you first, and maybe if you say your organisation, Colin. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Colin Byrne. I'm the Gender and Humanitarian Advocacy Advisor with Trócaire. I just wanted to ask in relation to the documenting of budget allocations or humanitarian or other financing towards GBV responses, how you see the impact of increasingly populist right-wing governments, which are pushing back on gender equality and women's rights, how that might influence not just how much money they donate or provide, but actually how they choose to record it. For example, you could choose to present a GBV response as a health response or a GBV response. And there might be political reasons why they might choose to present one over the other in the current context. I'm thinking in particular, for example, in the context of Project 2025 and a potential new Trump administration. Thanks.
We might just take a few questions in one go. So I think we have Girl Kind Kenya. I'm not sure, were you just saying hello or if you have a question? I think you were just saying hello. If we have no questions right now, maybe I'll pass that one to Elizabeth and others can be thinking of questions.
Sure.
So that question from Colin, do you want me to repeat it, Elizabeth, or is it okay?
No, thank you for starting with a softball question. So of course, yeah, I think that that's a great point, right? And I think that's something that is particularly concerning when we look at funding for the field, even leaving aside the current political climate in the US, which of course I am American, I'm currently based in the US. It feels extremely, extremely fraught. But, even leaving that aside, there has been a discussion within the sector of the imbalance of diversity of funding. So even if we don't have Project 2025 and we continue with an administration that is open to overseas development assistance and open to explicitly working on gender issues, it's a problem for the sector that there's such an imbalance in funding, right? That it is so fragile about what happens within domestic governments and how those policies change. Of course, probably many people on this call have experienced that with work with the UK government and with how things have changed with the closing of DFID and the reorganization and their government. So I think it's a really important topic, and I think that it's really important for us to be talking to new and diverse funders. And I'll say, at least from my perspective, in the American context of foundation giving. So we can look at the Gates Foundation, which is a huge funder in the sector of international development, but traditionally has been quite low in funding on gender-based violence. And really thinking about what are the specific messages that we need to create to engage with funders who haven't traditionally been giving in GBV, but whose work is contingent on GBV work, right? We know this is a multi-sectoral area. We know it impacts all outcomes. And so we have to, as practitioners in this field, also be thinking about what's the language, what's the data, what's the arguments we need to convince these partners to come into this space. A lot of people don't want to because it takes a lot of time maybe to do social norm change, or maybe they feel like it's too politically sensitive and too fraught. So we have to give them the information and the arguments they need to justify internally to be giving. But I think it's a really great point that you raise. We are I mean, personally, it's a very fraught time leading up to this election.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We have another question here. Gaia Pellecci, do you want to come on mic to say the question?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. A very interesting presentation. I was curious to ask if it's possible to define what are donors that tend to provide funding, if it's possible ever to generalize mostly to women-led organization or women rights organization, or other that would prefer, for example, partnership, multilateral organization, NGOs, those that instead provide funding for UN, etc. And if I may add another question, I was also curious around thematic areas. For example, if do we have visibility? If, for example, recent trends point that there is more funding for humanitarian response versus more social norms change, transformation, prevention, risk mitigation, etc. Over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Do you want me to summarize there maybe? Yeah, which donors provide funding to women's rights organizations, and what are the trends, humanitarian versus social norms work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think I'll start with the second question. We don't have the ability right now under the existing tracking systems to disaggregate to that level of detail. And so that is a major issue that we just have these umbrella terms. We're not able to split up by prevention, mitigation, response, or typology of intervention. And of course, if we think back to the beginning of the socio-ecological framework, and we know work is happening across all of those different domains, and it's being conflated in how it's being reported. So that's certainly an area of interest and more research. Some of the other research reports that I referenced, they tried to look at getting more granularity by doing a sampling of the individual reports that came in and to see if they could ascertain some trends and make some predictions about what the funding is. But it's still a real challenge and it's very inconclusive. As far as the donors that are giving to different groups, that is what you can search for on both of these systems. So you can go in and you can look for, you can choose a recipient. You can either say who's giving to women's rights organizations and it'll pull up the donors and rank them for you, or you can do it inversely. But you really have to, off the top of my head, I would say, you know, you really have to go in and look at the system, but it is traditionally the main government donors. You have a lot from the US, the EU, you have a lot from several of the Scandinavian countries, Japan, Korea. So yeah, and it's going to the traditional UN agencies.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I think that's answered quite a few people had asked about funding to the grassroots and women's led. So as you've said, we need to go into the detail on the tracking systems. I might go now to Trust Maka, Kimigisha, Miria, if you want to come on mic and ask a question, and then we might take one or two more before you finish. Thanks.
Thank you so much. My name is Trust Maka. I work with Goal Uganda as a JC advisor. This is a good platform. I'm really happy to be part of this meeting. My key question was focusing on the strategic way. What strategic way are we adopting from this meeting? We have discussed, yes, these key issues are very important, but we need to strategically build the cause. Have information. How are we going to structure the information from different communities, partners, to ensure that we build the cause to, as we meet the donor, as we forward it to the donor, you need to have the cause clearly highlighted, clearly built, so that it is supported. The funding may not easily come, but we need to build it from onset. And then also, if the funding is there, which people are we targeting to work with? I'm speaking this from the background in this side of Uganda, where women cannot easily speak out. And when we look at issues of gender-based violence, they affect so much women, young children, and the youth. But now we need to engage to think of the partners we are going to work with to ensure we have this information clearly and build our common cause. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, that's a great question. I think so. I would point to two resources that I mentioned earlier, and that'll be linked. And those are the Prevention Collaborative and the Accelerator to NGBV. And those are partnerships that are focused exactly on what you're talking about, which is about having a shared advocacy agenda for how we are advocating for more and better funding. And those are open to anyone who's working in the field, both to participate or to share your ideas and to share resources. I think that, this issue of how do we have shared language and how do we reinforce with each other to advocate for more funding is something that these groups are really looking at very seriously. I think also, linked to that is this issue of how are we coordinating between different groups that maybe in the past haven't necessarily coordinated around the VAC-VA divide, but really we know there's so much overlap to each other. And I think that you'll see that some of the groups that are going to be engaging in this upcoming ministerial conference are looking at that. But, of course, also, many of these responses are so localized that we have to, recognize that there's a certain limitation for global organizations or global frameworks to actually engage at the local level. And that's why if we are part of these global frameworks, that we are consistently advocating for more resources to go to our colleagues on the ground. And I think, all we can do is just to keep repeating that. So if we are in a position of sitting at these, high-level multilateral international groups, we want to just keep reinforcing that over and over and over again. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have time for maybe one more, some closing from Rasheen.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think we have one last question from Nuer Al-Musawi. I don't fully follow the question in the chat, so maybe I'll ask Nuer to read it out or to raise the question.
Yeah, I think it wasn't a question, it's more of a reflection. It's really, for example, in Iraq, we do talk a lot, it's more about CEDAW and 1325 and its peace and security. And I know that we are in the transition from humanitarian to development. However, really the development phase, we have really some real challenges with governance, and it's hard really to tackle, to do advocacy without going against the we don't want to end up in a situation where we are like Afghanistan, for example. That's very dangerous. So I think, when talking about women issues, women equality, it's really in Iraq now, it is becoming a very sensitive issue, especially when you are confronting political groups. And generally, gender, I know the term gender per se is not even allowed there, but to really work with different, what gender means, disability, elderly, young boys, girls, adolescents, this, and I think also it has to be multi-sectoral, because even for the people, they don't get or grasp the concept of gender-based violence. They're very much rooted. These are very rooted, habits and cultural norms in their communities. So I think we really have to take it outside of this, like, especially for us in the government itself, it's very much like, oh, the gender unit or the woman empowerment unit. Sorry, but it's in every sector, and that's how we have to look at it. Even from a humanitarian perspective, it has to be multi-sectoral, it has to be gender integrated rather than focused on one issue, a women's role in peace and security. But women are unable to access healthcare, because of GBV.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Noor, for those comments. I'll come back to that in a minute. Just to the last person there, Nasono, we did answer the question about grassroots organisation, who funds that, and it wasn't particularly about faith. I don't think you mentioned faith earlier. and that we, as Elizabeth had said, to go to the tracking as was explained and break down, and you will see then who is funding the grassroots organisations. So maybe I'll just wrap up now, and thank you, Noor, as you finished there saying, you know, the big scope of GBV, and we shouldn't look at it in isolation, which is kind of where Elizabeth started off, talking about the scope of GBV being large, and it affects men and boys, LGBTQ+, as well as women and girls, and all across prevention, mitigation and response. The high cost of gender-based violence to countries going back to 2014, and the World Bank saying it costs 3.7% of GDP. So the onus is on governments to fund this and to increase the funding. We have, as Elizabeth explained, in recent years, both OCHA and the OECD introduced specific codes related to violence against women and girls, which provides unparalleled insight into the state of funding. However, the funding remains low, as Mary said at the beginning, less than 0.69% of humanitarian and less than 1% of overseas development aid. And while the tracking systems are really helpful, they are not perfect, and they have mandatory reporting for some and not others, and don't capture everything. As we explained, the World Bank, some of the funding is captured under the OECD and much more of it is not. The challenges around the multi-sectoral funding within OCHA, the information is constantly being updated, so do always check back. As Elizabeth explained, the data can change as new figures come in and are added to it. In terms of the OECD, some of the issues are being looked at. An internal meeting a couple of months ago, trying to add clarity at the moment within the gender line. Funding for women's led and women's rights organisations, which came out strongly in the chat, is currently collected together with government institutions. So they are looking hopefully at addressing that. There are other emerging opportunities, non-traditional sources of funding. We looked at the WOCAN, a woman-led international membership network that developed the W+ standard, a way of buying credits similar to carbon footprints. But the recommendation is give more, give better, multi-annual flexible funding. And money needs to go to the grassroots organisations and not have strict, complicated modalities for reporting on the funding that would rule out grassroots organisations to get the funding. So now Niamh will put some items in the chat. Thank you very much for joining us. We would like to thank you for coming today and to tell you we have another event during 16 days where we will launch our new research from survivor-centred to survivor-led accountability on GBV on the 25th of November at 3 o'clock Irish time. And the invite for that, you can join up to our newsletter and get the invite, or you can look at our website. And lastly, just to say, we will have a short 5-minute or less survey if you could fill out to help us with next time. But thank you so much. It's great to have such a large attendance here today. Thank you to Elizabeth for the research, and we will also share the research link, the full paper. Thanks to Mary for the introduction and to my colleague Niamh for all attending. All the best.